and as this is a hybrid event, we have people on Zoom, and we will take questions from the public here in person and on Zoom. Duncan Large is Executive Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. He is Professor of European Literature and Translation at the same university and Chair of the PETRA-E Network. He taught previously at the universities of Oxford, Paris 3, Dublin, and Swansea. He is co-editor of the monograph series Rubik's Book Experience in Literary Translation. He is also one of the 3 general editors of the complete works of Friedrich Nietzsche, published by Stanford University Press. Duncan has published translations from the French of Sarah Kaufmann, Nietzsche and Metaphor, and from the German of Friedrich Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols and Exicon. His most recent book publications are 2 co-edited volumes, Untranslatability, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, and Nietzsche's Exicon. Duncan, it is a real honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Theodora. I'm going to share my screen straight away for those who are online. I hope that is working. Yes, good. So, Theodora, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the kind invitation to give this lecture. Welcome to those who have just joined us, whether here in person at Sofia University in Bulgaria or to those who are online. I'm giving this lecture then on the 30th of May, no less, which you may be aware is the anniversary of the death of Voltaire. Ever since I learned that Friedrich Nietzsche not only dedicated his book Menschliches allzu Menschliches, Human all too human, to Voltaire, but hastened to complete it in time for publication on the 30th of May 1878 to mark the centenary of Voltaire's death, my thoughts have turned to the great Enlightenment philosopher at this time of year. Good. On this 30th of May, then, let me open with an epigraph from Voltaire's 1734 text, Lettres philosophiques, which contains his most rousing statement on translation. Now, for those of us in the room looking at the big screen, I think I can maybe do better than that. Good. Okay. So, my epigraph. Malheur aux faiseurs de traduction littérale qui, traduisant chaque parole, énerve le sens. C'est bien là qu'on peut dire que la lettre tue et que l'esprit vivifie. The translation is there for you. This call to arms, a rousing defense of, shall we say, translation with latitude, comes just after Voltaire has presented us with a very free translation of Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy in rhyming Alexandrines. We'll come back to the question of the latitude and creativity of the translator later on. For now then, let's move on from my epigraph and turn to the matter in hand. This public event forms part of a 2-day meeting of the PETRA-E Network, an organization that was founded back in 2017 to bring together institutions from across Europe and now beyond, from inside and outside academia, that share an interest in the education and training of literary translators. The activities of PETRA-E are centered on the Petra-E Framework, which presents a kind of roadmap that breaks down the career of a literary translator into 5 stages, ranging from beginner to expert, and breaks down their expertise into 8 different kinds of competence, ranging from transfer competence to research competence, forming a grid of no fewer than 136 descriptors altogether. Now, in this talk, I want to address a series of interlinked issues that all derive from the broader question of the relation between translation, specifically literary translation, and research. The starting point for my inquiry is a recognition that the research competence included in the Petra-E framework is, I think, problematic in a number of ways. So I want to look into that and ultimately suggest some revisions to the framework for the next iteration. Those of us familiar with the framework know that it's only just been revised, so but it's a never-ending project. More broadly, though, I want to open up to the more general question of translation as research and set the Petra-E framework in the context of a discussion that has been conducted under that heading, translation as research, in my home country, the UK, and the Anglosphere more generally for over a decade, but which has, I think, received less attention in continental Europe. And that will allow us, in turn, to address some quite fundamental questions for our discipline, namely, what is literary translation, and even what is research? So, ladies and gentlemen, my paper for you this evening is nothing if not ambitious. If you ask a professional translator what they understand by research, then it may well involve things like consulting dictionaries, whether bilingual or monolingual, perhaps more specialized historical dictionaries, dialect dictionaries, picture dictionaries, and so on. Other kinds of reference work, catching references and allusions in the source text, idioms and set expressions, and trying then to convey them optimally for the target readership. In the digital age, of course, there are many more resources consultable online, such as the web as corpus and other text corpora, electronic concordances and other databases. In both analog and digital worlds, there are informants and networks. Translators of historical novels, say, might consult many historical works to get a feel for the target language discourse. Translators of whodunits and police procedurals will need an intimate familiarity with the relevant semantic fields in both languages, and so on. Now, this kind of research is certainly represented in the Petra-E framework, but it doesn't go by the name of research there. Instead, these competencies are separated off under other headings. So I've given a couple here: heuristic competence, literary, cultural competence, and you can see that these include things like finding reference material, situating a source text within source culture. These are included in the Petra-E framework, not under the heading of research, but for many researchers, for many translators, this is precisely the kind of thing that they routinely do by way of researching a translation project. So if we now examine what is included in the Petra-E framework under the heading research competence, then we find the following definition, quote, the ability to conduct methodical research in order to inform translation practice. Now, this strikes me as quite a narrow definition, a narrow understanding, perhaps not of translation as research, but of research for translation. It's also quite vague, but the descriptors put more flesh on the bones. It's perhaps difficult to read from any distance, so let me just quote them. The descriptors under research competence at level 2, which is advanced learner, can apply research methodologies, can distinguish and name existing translation techniques, knows several theories of translation, can analyze translations on an academic level, knows schools of thought in translation studies. These are what one might call more meta, more academic, theoretical kinds of knowledge about translation techniques and theories. I believe this implication is the case in the other languages into which the framework has been translated too, where the research competence is rendered in these ways. I'm not going to go through them all, but this is simply these are the headings for in the different language versions of the Petra-E framework for what is called in English research competence. There will, I hope, be time at the end for questions, and I'd be very interested to hear about any ways in which you think my arguments suffer from being too reliant on an understanding of research in an English language context. At any rate, what the framework doesn't envisage under research competence or any other is translation itself as a form of knowledge, of scholarship, or indeed research. And that's an important point to which I'll return shortly. But before I do that, I'd just like to finish with the research competence in the Petra-E framework. And there are a number of other features here that suggest it's been, well, what the Germans call stiefmütterlich behandelt. It's been treated with stepmotherly neglect, perhaps. For a start, what are we talking about? The research competence is number 8 out of 8. It's the final category and brings up the rear almost, I think, apologetically. Now, the order of competences in the Petra-E framework is quite explicitly supposed not to be a hierarchical ranking. And I quote here from the rationale that accompanies the framework, quote, "At the outset, the Petra-E model chose a linear structure to avoid any impression of hierarchy in the sub-competences," and continues, "It should be stressed that the order of competences is not hierarchical." Nonetheless, methinks this doth protest too much. Some non-hierarchical rankings are more non-hierarchical than others. I remember during the framework development discussions, the research competence was the most controversial category and proved most objectionable indeed to professional translators because it seemed the most dispensable. By contrast with, say, the opening competencies, transfer and language, which nobody could possibly discount from the activity of translation. In practice, I know anecdotally that some teachers, in explaining the competencies, effectively leave the research competence out. They resist treating it as a core competence and say it's optional. Interestingly, I can't remember that we received any feedback on the research competence in the once the first version of the framework was published in 2016, with the result that although several of the other competences were revised when we produced a revised version of the whole framework last year, the research competence emerged unamended. But I don't think that is to say that it should stay as it is. For another thing, of the 8 competences, it's the one that is most sparsely populated with descriptors. And most of its sub-competencies are assumed to have been acquired by L2, the advanced learner stage. Curiously then, although it's the only competence not to have any descriptors at L1, the beginner level, it's fundamentally conceived as a low-level set of sub-competencies covering activities that are assumed to be part of every translator's toolkit by the time they leave formal education. So the Petra-E framework has a rather modest, minimalist view of what research means in the translation context. By contrast, let's turn next to what one might call the maximalist approach to the issue, as it has been developed in recent years, particularly, I think, in the UK and North America, thanks to a lively discussion around the question of translation as research. Now, it's important to know the context for this discussion. Let me take you back to 1986. when the government of the day in the UK, the Conservative government, introduced what was then known as the Research Assessment Exercise, the RAE, into UK universities. This obliged every academic to give an account of their research activities and introduced peer review panels that would grade every department according to the quality of its research. This grade would then become a simple multiplier when it came to allocating funding for research activities. So the RAE erected quite an elaborate set of hoops for universities to jump through. It was deliberately dirigiste and aimed to take academics out of their ivory towers, directing research towards more economically beneficial impacts outside of academia. This system has been in place for almost 4 decades, measured out in reporting cycles that have varied in length from 3 years to 8. This exercise is now known as the Research Excellence Framework, and the current cycle concludes in 2029, as we can see. Now, as you might imagine, the RAE, the REF, have had a profound effect on the research landscape in the UK. They've moved it in the direction of economic benefit, making researchers in all disciplines, and not just the natural sciences and engineering, apply for external funding to support their research, in the process, of course, saving the government money. From the perspective of translation, though, the effect has been wholly deleterious, negative. It's fair to say, I think, for although it's never been a problem to include translation studies research as part of this exercise, translations themselves have been largely excluded. So let me give you a personal example. These are some of my own translations. The middle one, my translation of Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. This was in the series Oxford World's Classics. It was published in 1998, and I was able to submit it to this research exercise in 2001, but only because I had been commissioned to provide a scholarly apparatus as well. So I submitted it as a scholarly apparatus, with a translation attached. And obviously did not feel too comfortable about doing that. There's an awful lot riding on the assessment exercise, though. The stakes are high. The exercise has very direct financial consequences for university departments, as well as for individual academics. And historically, this has led to a lot of self-censorship and dissuaded academics from engaging in translation practice, which might be frowned on by the research administration at their institution. It's had a disproportionate effect precisely in areas like philosophy translation, where historically it's moonlighting academics who have done a great deal of the translating work. And if translations don't count as research, then that work simply won't get done. In extremis, then, academics in the UK involved with translation have been making a concerted effort to have translation recognised as research for the purposes of these research assessment exercises. And they've been able to ally themselves with colleagues in North America, where even without the scaffolding of these research exercises, the publish or perish culture and the associated grading of research outputs for the purposes of promotion and grant acquisition has put translating academics under similar pressures. Translators and translation scholars are by no means alone in having to fight their corner in this way, though, and they've been able to ally themselves also with colleagues facing similar problems in cognate disciplines, which have creative practices at their heart. I'm thinking of creative writing, drama, filmmaking, fine art, dance, architecture, and so on. Now, I hope you'll forgive me sharing the plight of academic translators in the UK with you. It may seem like a relatively parochial concern, but it has produced, I think, some really interesting and wide-ranging thinking about the relationship between translation and research. I put on a slide some of the what seem to me to be the key contributions from scholars in North America and the UK. So Catherine Porter and Esther Allen and Judith Woodsworth in the States, Nick Harrison, Charles Forsdick in the UK, Nicholas Harrison in particular, Translation as Research, a manifesto, which was signed by a large number of translators and academics in the UK 10 years ago or so. And there's a large conference coming up in September to kind of assess the situation now. Let's go back a bit further, though, because a foundational document for this debate was a research paper published in 1993 titled Research in Art and Design by Christopher Frayling, who was then Professor of Cultural History at the Royal College of Art in London. And he was responding to the early years of the research assessment exercise, and he sets about defining research in a way that might be more appropriate to his and ultimately our discipline than the available natural scientific models. So a paper called Research in Art and Design. And in order to do this, in order to define research in a new way, he adapted the model of earlier model of education from Herbert Reed, a model of education through art, to describe different ways of thinking about research, noting that research could be for practice, where research aims are subservient to practice aims. Research could be into practice, such as observing the working processes of others, or through practice, where practice serves a research purpose. So Frayling is thinking about the relation then between research and different kinds of practice, whether the fine arts or, and I think this is relevant to translation. So I'd like to revisit the Petra-E framework in the light of these categories. Frayling's sense one, research could be for practice, is covered, it seems to me, by the common sense understanding of research embodied in the framework's notions of heuristic and literary cultural competencies. The research competence in section 8 seems to me to fall squarely under Frayling's second category, research into practice. This would cover all kinds of academic research in translation studies, including the kinds of research carried out by taught and research postgraduate students for their dissertations. This would explain perhaps why the research competence might be seen as peripheral by practitioners. But it also explains, I think, why this kind of work is obviously acceptable to a research assessment exercise, because it generates traditional kinds of research output, essays, articles, monographs in the history of translation or translation theory, the kind of material that I publish in my Routledge series, Routledge Studies in Literary Translation. What about translations themselves, though, as research? What about Frayling's third sense of research through practice? It seems to me this is the most maligned and least well understood of his three categories, but it's also the area into which most effort has been put in recent years, as humanities researchers have moved the terms of the debate away from the unquestioned acceptance of the natural scientific understanding of what research is. So the term research itself has been expanded and redefined in recent decades, in English at least, precisely in order to incorporate the notion of research through practice. It goes by several names: practice-based research, practice-led research, but the current consensus is simply practice research. On one definition, quote, practice-based research is a research method that involves performing a practice to generate data and gain knowledge. Now, historically, of course, the mere thought that translation might in any way be generative was often resisted. The notion of practice research, then, is aimed squarely at those who might be tempted to think of translation as unoriginal, automatic, and unconsidered, the mere repetition of an existing text. Although we have Borges's Pierre Minard to remind us that even merely rewriting is a far from unoriginal activity. I want next, though, to consider some of the ways in which translation activities might count as research. Translation as research, then. Well, our first candidate here would be the translation of scientific research. So I'm thinking of translations of important breakthroughs in medicine or something. That's one sense, of course, but a rather narrow sense, and I don't want to dwell on it. I don't think this is translation as research in a way that is helpful to us. I think there are other senses which are more interesting and more helpful, and I'm going to suggest 4 of them. Secondly, then, the translation of other kinds of knowledge. Here a lot depends on how you define knowledge. Ever since Plato's Republic, fictional texts and their authors have had a very bad reputation when it comes to factual knowledge. Notoriously, Plato banishes poets from his ideal republic because they lie, and their fictional lies corrupt their readers, seducing them away from genuine knowledge. But of course, there are countless examples to the contrary of source texts as sources of knowledge, which are then translated. Starting with the performative self-contradiction that is the Republic itself, with its fictionalized scenario and rhetorical tricks. In a text like Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, science is born out of poetry. And since its origins, fiction has been a purveyor of all kinds of factual information, with the result that literary translators have contributed to the generation of new knowledge in the target culture. Within literary history, countless are the examples of, say, the introduction of new poetic forms into a literature through translation. Certainly in English, I could mention forms like the sonnet or the haiku, which have been introduced into a literary culture through translation, enriching it, seeding the development of indigenous responses. Another way of looking at this is to ask oneself, how knowledgeable are translators? And I would say the answer is usually very knowledgeable indeed. Let's not forget that level 5 in the Petra-E framework envisages the literary translator's professional development culminating in the attainment of expertise. So is that merely a misapprehension? Aside from linguistic knowledge in all its varieties and in both source and target languages, in any source text you care to name, there will be culture-specific items which need recognizing and indeed researching, to the point where experienced translators have earned themselves, it seems to me, the title of cultural ambassadors and achieved genuine cultural expertise. To cite Plato's Republic once more, one of the cudgels with which Plato beats poets is precisely over the question of expertise, when he argues that poets merely simulate expertise. And if you wanted expert advice on how to conduct a military campaign, for example, you'd be best advised to consult a general rather than the author of a poem about war, even if that poem is the Iliad. What about the translator of the Iliad? Is it like Plato's analogy of the cave, where the Iliad is already a pale imitation of the knowledge that a general has, and the translator of the poem is therefore at one further remove from genuine knowledge? I don't think it works like that. I think such denigration is misplaced. I have real faith in the genuine expertise of translators. Now, certain texts undoubtedly call for more of this kind of research than others. When it comes to purveying factual knowledge and conceptual truths through translation, there's undoubtedly a kind of spectrum according to text type. And translators of texts in, say, philosophy, history, and the social sciences undoubtedly make genuine contributions to enriching the target culture and its knowledge banks. Think of the state-sponsored translation projects in cultures such as ancient Alexandria, or Abbasid Baghdad, or Meiji Japan, for examples of the deliberate pursuit of knowledge, the acquisition of new ideas through translation. Sociologist Richard Freeman writes of translation in this sense, that it, quote, seems to represent some new epistemological lubricant, facilitating the dissemination of texts and the application and use of the knowledge and information they contain. Let me note at this point that in opening up a spectrum of text types in this way, and arguing that they all fall to the remit of the literary translator, I'm also raising an important and fundamental question for the Petra-E framework, namely, what does it count as literature? It's all very well to say that, well, translators of philosophy and social sciences texts are what one might call agents of knowledge, but is this what we would like to call literary translation? At one of the editions of the European School of Literary Translation some years ago, I was struck by a distinction that Lawrence Venuti introduced between two different characterizations of the domain of literary translation, one more restricted, one more expansive. And he called them respectively belletristic and humanistic. I think we need to acknowledge an unspoken truth then that the Petra-E framework assumes the more expansive humanistic definition, so that it also applies to translations, or more specifically translators, of scripture, philosophy, historical accounts, and so on, the whole panoply of what is called non-fiction in English these days. In this respect, the framework, it seems to me, is in good company. Harvard University Press's Loeb Classical Library defines itself as, quote, the only existing series that, through original text and English translation, gives access to all that is important in Greek and Latin literature. But on its web homepage, the marquee titles are all humanistic. They're by Aristotle, Julius Caesar, Augustine, Plato, Hippocrates, and Cicero. Let's return then to the question of translation as research and extend my typology. We've only got 2 bullet points in, so I'll need to move a bit more quickly through the remaining kinds. Really, some kinds of source text need more researching than others, but that's not to say that literary translation as research is just about expanding conceptual knowledge either. What other kinds of literary knowledge are there? Let's consider next not just the translation of knowledge, but the creation of new knowledge through translation. It's often recognized that the translator of a source text is its first reader, and crucially, its first interpreter. Translators are often forced to decide on issues that remain implicit in their source text. On this basis, all translation is a kind of commentary premised on and in turn incorporating a new interpretation. All translation is in this sense a voyage of discovery, opening up new horizons for others. One only has to read John Keats's marvelous testament to translation, his 1816 sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, to recognize that it's actually a no-brainer that translation opens up new knowledge. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne, yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortes when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. That's John Keats in 1816. A more recent example of the same world-making impetus can be found in the analogy that Matthew Reynolds makes with his notion of prismatic translation, using a disseminatory model of translation as a kind of prism that carries out, to quote Reynolds, a release of multiple signifying possibilities, an opening of the source text for language in all its plurality. In a similar vein, Kasia Szymanska coins the term translation multiples in a new book. This has just been published 3 days ago, so I haven't read it yet, but here's the blurb. In Translation Multiples, Kasia Szymanska examines what happens when translators, poets, and artists expose the act of translation by placing parallel translation variants next to one another in a standalone work of art. Analyzing such translation multiples as a new genre of writing, she explores how an original text can diverge into variants, how such multiplicity can be displayed and embraced, and how the resulting work can still be read as a coherent text. One of the classic ways in which historically translators have been innovative and original is by developing the target language itself, adding to the word hoard through calques and neologisms. I could cite innumerable examples of the establishment of vernacular literary languages through acts of translation. But if we go back to one of the earliest exponents of what one might call translation theory in the Western tradition, Cicero, then in 55 BCE, we find him already making the case for the translator coining new language as Latin emerges from the shadow of Greek through his translation work. I'll spare you my Latin. I'll quote the English. This is André Lefebvre's translation. I decided to take speeches written in Greek by great orators and to translate them freely, and I obtained the following results. By giving a Latin form to the text I had read, I could not only make use of the best expressions in common usage with us, but I could also coin new expressions analogous to those used in Greek, and they were no less well received by our people as long as they seemed appropriate. I think it's striking that at the very beginning of this long Western tradition of translation theory, we have Cicero arguing for a very creative style of translation. Now, translators have not always been praised for such efforts, and some have undoubtedly fallen flat. For Heidegger, for example, the wholesale translation of Greek philosophy into Latin made a decisive intervention of the wrong kind, in his view, and set Western philosophy on a wrong course for the next 2 millennia. But I think Heidegger is an outlier here, and such efforts have generally been welcomed. Of course, all translation is creative, original writing in the basic sense that the translator writes an entirely new set of words. As British translator Daniel Hahn expresses it with typically acerbic wit, my job is to do exactly the same as the original, except for all the words. You have to create this entirely different language with the effect of the original. Now, there's a whole other set of arguments about translation and creativity that I don't have time to go into in any detail here. Apart from anything else, we had a panel discussion on the topic in Thessaloniki in one of our Petra-E meetings back in 2019. But viewing translation as research tends to place a premium on more creative ways of translating. translations that push the envelope, inventing new ways to do translation itself. One is reminded of the transformative potential of translation as conveyed in the historical use of metaphors from alchemy, as in here Sir John Denham justifying his egregiously domesticating translation style in his version of Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid. So it's an extended metaphor from alchemy then. Poesy is of so subtle a spirit that in pouring out of one language into another, it will all evaporate. And if a new spirit be not added in the transfusion, there will remain nothing but a caput mortuum. So again, it's another argument in favor of transforming, what he calls transfusing, transmuting. The translators are kind of mages or alchemists. Translation has always been viewed as an art of transformation. And this is conveyed admirably, I think, by Jhumpa Lahiri in her translation of and theoretical preoccupation with Ovid's Metamorphoses. This kind of experimentalism in translation has spread rapidly in recent years, with translators being recognized as authors. And this opens up the possibility of new, more radical translation methods that expand our understanding of what even counts as translation. I'll just briefly pick out two recent examples again from colleagues in the UK. In this case, the volume Translation and Multimediality derived from a conference in Cambridge in 2019, devotes attention then to multimodal translation, in the words of its subtitle, translation then which takes us beyond words. Multimodal translation then, and a final example from the UK, a project devoted to experiential translation. This is headed by Ricardo Vidal and Madeline Campbell. I'm showing you here two recent volumes that have derived from this project, where they're understanding experiential translation then as expanding the notion of translation beyond both linguistic and modal and medial borders, they say, to embrace post-humanist perspectives through a holistic experiential epistemology, which envisages translation as engaged, situated social practice. So these are just a couple of ways in which contemporary translation projects in the UK are broadening the definition of translation, I think, immeasurably. And it should be noted that this latter project, the Experiential Translation Project, was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And so that indicates how far this kind of experimental approach to translation has been normalized by now and attained respectability in the eyes of these research assessment exercises that I was mentioning earlier. So let's return then from the academic arguments and take stock. Within academia, research is highly valued. It's what gets you promotion and tenure, grant funding. So naturally, it's in the interest of academic translators to have their activity designated as research. But is this all just special pleading on behalf of academics? How generalizable is this set of arguments? Would it even be welcomed by most translators? Would they feel flattered to be considered researchers? Would any translator object to being considered a researcher? Is it a distortion to redefine all translation as research? And does it inevitably lead to academic, formalistic translations awash with footnotes and other paratextual apparatus that bring translation into disrepute? Perhaps some kinds of translation should be excluded from consideration as research. I don't know, I think it's the wrong question in a way. Maybe we should discount, oh, I don't know, genre fiction or children's fiction translation from research, from this notion of research. But I think such Such exclusions would be hugely short-sighted. Translating genre fiction or children's fiction can be hugely conceptually demanding, can confront the translator with many culture-specific items, much creative language use, oblige the translator to take account of illustrations in the original, and so on. It doesn't pay to be snobbish, to be dismissive about certain text types and try and decree that they don't represent a research practice. Much better to acknowledge that ultimately all translation involves research on some level, but it is a spectrum, not a binary. Resistance to viewing translation as research has mainly come, I think, not from within the world of professional translators, but from those who want to keep a pristine, natural science-inflected view of what research even is. Here, the research assessment exercise has been very successful in redefining research so that arts and humanities research can be included and viewed as legitimated. So in conclusion, I'd like to push this argument even further and turn around, flip the relation between translation and research. What happens to the question of translation as research if we reconceive research itself from the point of view of translation studies? So far, the paper has been about making translation conform to a notion of research, which perhaps has been expanded. But now, just in conclusion, I'm going to turn it around and think about, well, how does translation as research affect our understanding of what research is? Beyond the interlingual translation of texts, translation has long served as a metaphor for knowledge transfers of all kinds, from the medieval understanding of the transfer of learning as a translatio studiorum to the more modern conception of translational research in medicine. But increasingly, translation is serving as a default paradigm in general accounts of knowledge production and construction. This is Richard Freeman again, arguing that, quote, the research process can be conceived as one of successive translations, from theoretical formulation to operationalization, transcription, interpretation, and dissemination. Or another example, Ines Dussel claims that, quote, research is always produced in and as translation between different sets of practices and registers. In many modern accounts such as these, translation emerges as an exemplary research practice. Indeed, the research practice par excellence. And as a consequence, one could argue that translation deserves not only to be recognized as research, but to be acknowledged as integral to modern research methodology. It's time to wrap up then. Let me just conclude by asking, where does this leave the Petra-E framework, and specifically that category of research competence? I suppose what I've been arguing is that it needs supplementing with some sub-competencies which reflect or at least acknowledge all the different achievements of practice research. What's more, I've argued that paying more attention to translation as research can help clarify the broad understanding of literary translation that the framework is working with. It's intended at least to be applicable to the translation of non-fiction material like philosophy and scripture, and thus uses a broadly humanistic definition of literary translation. I've used the framework in this talk, though, as a springboard to think more generally about the relationship between translation and research, and effectively argued that in order to put the two terms into the most fruitful relationship, we actually need to redefine both. You need, on the one hand, a more creative understanding of what translation is, giving more respect to experimental translation practices such as multimodal translation, experiential translation, and so on. But you need to redefine what you mean by research too, and perhaps even redefine research as a kind of translation. Thank you. Sorry, that was about more like 50 minutes in there. I think we still have a little time. I hope we have a little time.
I think we have
Questions. I'll stop sharing. Yeah. Okay, so I think people can.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm sure that most of us didn't consider translation as research in so many aspects. I'm sure the talk has provoked a lot of comments and questions, so please come forward and ask.
In the chat, okay.
There wasn't anything, no, it's not new.
Ah, okay. So I think they're not actual questions.
Well, may I just start by asking that could we consider translation as research by taking into account the simple act of interpretation, which is not simple, but which is intrinsic to any translation, and then when this interpretation is put into words into another language, this already could be considered a research because it brings new knowledge. So from this point of view, every translation is research. If I have understood you well.
That's right. Yes, I was calling that the maximalist approach. I was reminded of Monsieur Jourdain as well, who suddenly realizes that all his life he's been speaking prose, and in some ways this is a potential recognition for all translators that they've been doing research all of their translation life. But I think what I wanted to explore though was whether, of course, I'm an academic who translates, and so I will naturally come from an academic perspective and from these research exercises and so on, which I wanted to share with you, but only because I think this area does raise some really interesting general questions for all translators. You know, would you like to be considered a researcher? Would you consider only some of your activity to be research? How useful to you are some of these new definitions of what research is that comes out of academic research? How useful are these redefinitions of research to you? And perhaps also, is this I was suggesting that this is a debate that's really been held in the UK, in the US, to an extent in Canada and Australia, within the English-speaking world that I'm familiar with. Is this a debate that is very familiar to you? Is it something which is yet to really take off in your country or in those areas that you're familiar with? Or does it have different inflections in your experience? That I put up a table, didn't I, of the different ways in which the notion of research competence has been translated in the Petra-E framework. And I'm assuming that there are certainly a number of different approaches to the notion of research there, but I'm not really very competent to discuss them all, so I left it as an open question. I don't know. Yeah, but I think I'm interested in this maximalist notion of translation as research, not just because I will be submitted to the next Research Excellence Framework, but because bit of interference online, maybe. Perhaps if you could, I could ask people to mute if you're not actually asking a question. Anyway, let me open up again. Is there Angela, I think online, would like to ask a question?
Yes. So I have been working with practices research a lot. And the basic of, practices research is a methodology that is broadly accepted in the arts, in the performing arts particularly. And they sorry, there's and they draw a line between the practitioner and the practitioner researcher. So in theory, the difference between a practitioner and a practitioner researcher is the level of insight into their own work. And so practitioner researchers in the arts claim that, and I'm quoting verbatim now, doing a play, making a dance is not a research topic. Similarly, if you transpose that line of reasoning into translation, is doing a translation per se is not a research topic unless there is a research question behind it and a clear-cut methodology and an answer to a research question that can only be investigated through practice. In that case, then translation could be considered research in itself, provided that it complies with those. But that is, I'm literally mediating a framework from the performing arts where this has been widely accepted. But if I think about a BA student or even a master student doing a translation and saying, okay, this counts as research, to me, the answer is no. But that's me coming from that background with that framework in mind. But I don't know if that contributes to your conversation.
Very much so, but did you want to come in on that already, or was this a separate question? Oh, sorry. Yes, I think we're going to need to come up and.
Yeah, I think this is fact. So this is just the definition of what academic research is. It has to answer to these sort of requirements. But I think, I mean, obviously translation can't do that in its own, but I think the line here to look for is the contribution to the knowledge field. So I think that a significant thing that makes research, except those, I mean, after these methodological sort of points are met, is if this research makes a contribution to the scientific field. And if it doesn't, then that research really doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really count as research either in the academic sense. And I think that the translation that could qualify is the one that develops new language. I think very often, or maybe always, this is translation of philosophy. But of course, in many ways, it's, I mean, there's a lot of literary translation when you take a literature into another culture that, well, you know, and it has to develop its own language. I think this is kind of the way to think of it, because it contributes in a, because every translation, of course, involves research, but this is really learning and a learning experience for the translator, and that's not really necessarily contributing to the field of knowledge, but developing new languages. So.
Sorry, did you say that translation cannot do what practice as research in the art does? Because I completely disagree with that.
I said that it can't answer to those methodological points that you made.
Cannot, or it can?
It doesn't always, but it can.
Well, okay, but yeah, anyway.
Well, actually it must. If it does, and I promise you it can, it does count, it can totally count as research, and it has to be knowledge producing, not necessarily by producing a text, because producing an artifact is not necessarily knowledge producing if it doesn't answer an actual research question. And it is possible, it is absolutely possible. It's just a matter of deciding how to go about it.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think, I don't know, I mean, this kind of, one is always on thin ice when one wants to kind of universalize a concept like translation as research and say, oh yes, well, on some level, all translations are research. That maybe cheapens one's understanding of what research is. And certainly there's a relatively low level notion of research, which I was working with in part of my talk, which involves, yes, looking things up in dictionaries and so on, that kind of more commonsensical notion of what research is. But I don't think, as I was suggesting, that there's a kind of spectrum here, and I don't think I would want to say, well, certain text types or certain activities that a translator engages in absolutely must be ruled out of consideration as research. But absolutely, Angela, I take your point that the thinking about practice research has become really quite sophisticated now. And yes, it's quite exclusionary in some ways. And if we're setting the bar very high and saying, well, no, as a translator, we need a methodology and we need to be considering our translation approach all the time. Apart from anything else, I mean, that sounds like, I don't know, Skopos theory or something. And not every practicing translator is going to want to sit down and consider their translation strategy in advance, even if we suggest as theoreticians that they should.
Translation approaches and strategies could be considered after the translation is done. So, and maybe this happens a lot. I mean, you just start a journey and you don't know how it will go, but finally you can analyze your work and yeah, that's also.
Thank you, Joe. Absolutely. Of course, the analysis can come after the fact.
I'm afraid that we are running out of time because we have another event and there's only one lift and a lot of stairs to the British Library. So
yes, we're in a different venue for the next event. Those online, thank you very much for joining us. And there is another event which you may like to join us for, which is our round table discussion of teaching literary translation. That does involve a different link though, and you'll need to fish that out of your email or your agenda if you don't have it to hand.
So let's wrap it up here, and I hope to see most of you in 10 minutes at the British Library or online. Thank you very much. It was
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for those questions and contributions.